panel on China's investment outlook amid a new policy environment, moderated by Asia Chairman at the Milken Institute, Robin Hu.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. And it's the first time I'm on a panel with two who's and two Lus. So I'm therefore very thankful that we have Secretary Rubin with us. I'm not going to spend time introducing who are the speakers on the panel. You know who they are. And I'm just going to dive in straight to the questions. So the first question for Secretary. Given your experience in championing free trade agreements like NAFTA during the time that you were Secretary of Treasury, how do you assess the current administration's emphasis on tariffs and the strategic decoupling from significant portion of the global supply chain?
Let me ask you, are we on the record, off the record? What are we? Chatham House rules?
It is Chatham House rules.
Chatham House rules. Mm-hmm. I don't think they have the foggiest notion of what they're talking about. That's what I think. I believe strongly, and Larry Summers made a comment the other day, which I think was right, and he said that virtually every mainstream economist, except for the people who work for Trump, believe in comparative advantage. And I think the more you think about comparative advantage, the more logic it sends. Now, people who know Trump for a long time told me that as early as the 80s, he had this belief in two things: tariffs, and that other countries were treating us unfairly if we had a trade deficit. I think neither of those propositions are true. But I'll just conclude this by making was to me a very troubling, an observation that to me is very troubling. We had an international global trading system. China clearly was up, at least in my opinion, was violating it in certain respects, and I think that did need to be dealt with. But now we're tearing it apart, and I think it's immensely to the detriment of the United States, and I think it's, what's this thing say? May we... Oh, we're on the record. Okay, who cares? Well, they're going to deport me or something. And even if they do, I'll have my choice of places to go because I can afford to do that. We're tearing apart an international trade regime that it seems to me served our country and the world very well. There clearly were problems, and one of them was dumping by China. But that we could have dealt with in a very specific kind of way instead of tearing the system apart. So that's I'll just make one of them I make. We also had a system of alliances that we built up, we the United States, built up following World War II that have served us extremely well. And now we're turning our back on that. And I think that is enormously unwise geopolitically. Right. And against that particular backdrop, with all that measurement that's been introduced, right? I mean, the export controls, the tariffs, the tax cuts, and so on and so forth. Do these policies undermine the benefits of the global economic prosperity, in your opinion, or do they represent the necessary and unnegotiable evolution of the trade strategy to address the geopolitical competition? In other words, the strategic accessory. Yeah, I think it's the exact opposite. I think that our best posture with respect to meeting our geopolitical challenges, which includes, I might add, the coming together of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, is to maintain this global trading order that has served us very well, not only economically, but in terms of our relationships with the rest of the world. So I think what we're doing is counterproductive economically and counterproductive geopolitically. And how do you think that we can wind down from that? Wind down? Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't. I think we've got a heck of a problem because we have an administration that's committed to this. Well, I want to add one other comment, by the way, that is committed to tariffs. I think, by the way, that the one caveat to everything I've said is I think it is important to secure our supply chains in areas that are important for our economy and our national security. And so I think that is right. And also there probably are some areas in which lateral effects are, you could do one thing and it causes something else to, or serve something else and serve development of something else. And that's another area where you might have some degree of protectionism justified. But I think another aspect of this is we have a trade treaty with Mexico and with Canada, USMC, and now we violated that And what kind of questions is that going to create around the world about our fealty to our commitments?
Right.
I think all of this is hugely counterproductive for the United States and for the globe.
Is this an effort to reset what is being perceived as being unfair trading system for the U.S.?
Yeah, I get it. The point that is those who have that view make is that it's unfair if we have a trade deficit. I think Larry Summers was right in saying there's virtually no mainstream economist in the world who would agree with that. Yeah, we have a trade deficit with some countries, we have surpluses with others. Overall, we have a trade deficit, and in time, now that actually can cut both ways too. If we have a current account deficit, let us say, not trade deficit. If you have a current account deficit, and then you have an inflow of capital, and the capital is going into investment, you actually can be better off in terms of growth. If over time you have a global account imbalance because of consumption, then that market forces will eventually correct that.
Right.
Do you think it's usually counterproductive is to try to do what we're doing now?
Will you recommend a very quick conversation on the phone between Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump?
Would I recommend that?
Mm-hmm.
You got a problem. Let me tell you, Hank Paulson had a very good piece, I think it was in the Washington Post today, or I got it online today, I don't know if it was today, about how to move forward from the current situation with the massive distrust in both countries of each other to where we should be. We both countries have this enormous self-interest in a constructive relationship, recognizing it'll be competitive. You have climate change, you have nuclear weaponry. There's the potential for nuclear weapons to be sold, or nuclear capability at least, to be sold to terrorists. Mm-hmm. You have the need for international trade norms. You have pandemics. You have AI. I've been taking a tutorial on AI for the last year and a half, and it has immense potentials on the plus side, but as Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt wrote in a recent book, it also has tremendous potential on the negative side. China and the United States together, if we had a cooperative relationship, using our combined economic might, could, I think, very substantially improve the way the world deals with all of these. And instead, we have this enormous distrust in both countries. And Hank had this piece in today's, I got it today, maybe it was yesterday's post, I don't know, about how to try to move from where we are to one where there is a cooperative relationship, but at the same time competitive, and recognizing there are differences that we simply have to deal with in the context, hopefully, of a cooperative relationship, not an antagonistic relationship.
Well, we'll come back to the AI point in just a bit, but in the meantime, Kevin, you want to add something to this conversation?
Sure. I think I would leave the discussion on the tariff itself to the trade experts and policy experts. As the investor, I look at on the China side, right? If you look at one of the reasons I think for some to advocate for a tariff, as the secretary has mentioned, is the perceived sort of deficit and surplus situation, right? Which is then, in turn, on the China side, is really driven by a Chinese economy that has been probably excessively dependent on export, investment, and infrastructure rather than consumptions, right? So I just Googled the line. I'll read it. I'll let you guess who said that and when, right? It says, China should unswervingly take expanding domestic demand as a long-term strategy for economic development. You would think that come from the U.S. Commerce Department, right? That was 2013 from Premier Wen Jiabao in his speech to the People's National Congress. Mm-hmm. So the Chinese economic problem of over-reliance on export and investment rather than domestic consumption is a long-term issue. It has been there, and it's a real problem, right? Obviously, whether the best solution is to install 145 or whatever that number is today of tariffs, that's an entirely different question. But there is a fundamental problem, economic problem on China's side. They need to resolve, tariffs or not. As an investor, I think that is always in my mind.
Well, Kevin, explain that. 12 years later, we are no better at encouraging domestic consumption on the part of the Chinese economy. There's some metrics, if I'm not wrong, I just read that the household spending relative to the total GDP in China is 35%. In Japan, it's 53%, and in the U.S., it's 69%, right? So that just goes to show, in the U.S., of course, the consumption pattern is very high. and then you get a credit line for consumers spending as well. In the case of Japan, of course, there's aging population, 53% aging people, you don't spend as much. But in China, you have a median age of 38, and it's 33% relative to GDP. So something is not quite right there. You want to comment on that, or before we ask Fred, the foremost macroeconomist, to comment?
So, in East Asia, starting with Japan and the four economic dragons, and of course China, generally it's like investment, export-related growth, with a very high domestic savings rate. So consumption has been relatively low. But after a certain period, as we have seen in Japan, you mentioned the example of Japan, in South Korea and Taiwan, we do see over time personal consumption as share of GDP will rise gradually. So China, I think, is in at the inflection point. Until recently, China, pursued very much export investment-led economic growth. But the last few years, pandemic and domestic regulatory uncertainty, plus some geopolitical uncertainty, certainly dampened the consumer sentiments. So consumption as a share of GDP has not risen meaningfully to offset whatever the external sector weakness, including the latest tariff. But there are efforts underway on both regulatory front, but also macroeconomic front, to revive consumer sentiments and pave the way for more sustainable private consumption spending. So it's a challenger, but it's also vast opportunity for China right now.
I think that's a great point. And there is also a school of thought, right? That is China being a Marxist proletariat, production, capacity comes foremost to mind, whereas consumption is a form of excess capitalism in the eyes of the Marxist proletariat. So how do you reconcile that? And China being a combination of a market economy, we know that is the case because it's very competitive in Chinese market. China is also a Marxist doctrine, and at the same time a Confucius in terms of value. How do the three blend together to produce a society that is high on consumption?
Robin, rest assured, very few people in China, out of 1.4 people, still, told the line you just quoted. China has a really, really vibrant urban middle class. Most people, they work very hard, they save, but also they increasingly willing to spend, not just EVs, latest smart gadgets, travel internationally on education, on healthcare, and on fancy Bordeaux, Burgundy wines, and European luxuries. So China has proven it can be a force, to be reckoned with in terms of consumption. So it's a period, right? When in the early stages of economic development, you need to build modern infrastructure, you need to build manufacturing base, you need to invest in R&D, in technology innovation. So you have to invest more. So you temporarily reduce consumption to use the savings to fund the necessary investment. So now China has reached the point, the infrastructure, I would say is nearly or even at world class, right? China already has probably globally most efficient competitive manufacturing industry. So it's time for China to really ramp up private consumption. And I think the government recognizes that, right? There are policies in place, and both are, again, on the macroeconomic side, fiscal and the monetary, but also on the regulatory side, in terms of social security, labor mobility, to facilitate more consumption.
All right. Secretary.
Fred, can I ask you one question? I remember a long time ago, Larry Summers and I were visiting with Xi in Beijing, and we were talking about this very subject, and he said we need to increase consumption. So we had a number of suggestions, none of which I guess were politically feasible or something, but would it help if you had, and maybe you have this, by the way, I'm not card enough to know, but I remember at the time we said to Xi, who we knew pretty well, I even once said to him, I think you're outstanding, you should come to the United States and run for president. But we do have a constitutional problem there, but leaving that aside. do you have a credit card system? And if you didn't, would a more robust one increase consumption? And secondly, if you have better social safety nets, would that increase consumption?
Totally, you're absolutely right. So on credit card, personal financing. So right now, Chinese household sector is a net credit to the economy. So they lend more to the rest of the economy than they borrow. The only borrowing is a mortgage, residential mortgage, right? But even on automobile, China now has overtaken U.S. as the biggest market for vehicles. But most car purchases are financed by cash. Okay, and non-recourse consumer financing is non-existent. Okay, so there's a long way to go for Chinese banking system to develop more consumer credit to ease kind of liquidity constraint, for consumption. Definitely, I think it's still work in progress. On the social security front, pension, healthcare, unemployment insurance are still very rudimentary. Zhongji was the leader who really tried to do something. I was involved in some of the, symposiums. So now we have individual retirement accounts. But given the rapid aging population, I think the pension system is still not robust enough to engender consumer confidence, right, about old age income support. And unemployment insurance is also payable minimum, so right now, consumer, the good news, Chinese consumers are not spending big. It's not because they don't have money. Rather, it's because they don't have confidence, with uncertainty. So the government can do better to mitigate some of the uncertainties.
I see. Well, Fred, I'm going to continue with you. The terrorist war is raging, right? But China seems rather unfazed by it all. Right? Very cool, at least on the surface. So in light of the escalating tariffs and the hard decoupling that is taking place now, how would you describe China's psyche and posture in the current circumstances? And what implication do you see this may have on foreign capital owners, on their level of confidence in Chinese assets?
I'm not sure if China is unfazed, right? Like everyone else in this room and globally, China is very concerned about the tariff wars. But from China's perspective, the initial response, right? China felt almost, no chance, but taking a very forceful stand, pushing back, right? And by imposing its own so-called retaliatory tariff, out of maybe principle, but also kind of dignity, okay? But it's important to keep in mind, just because China has taken an initial defined stance, doesn't mean China has given up diplomacy altogether. I believe China is very open and stands ready to, have talks, when the conditions are right. So because, the tit for tat confrontation, clearly is lose-lose situation. The stakes are very high, as the current Secretary of Scott Bessent, says this is 145% U.S. tariff and 125%, tariff from China. It's just simply unsustainable, right? The longer it takes, this trade, tension lost, the more economic harm is going to do to both sides, right? We talk about inflation, consumer spending, on businesses, supply chain disruption on both sides. So I think it's imperative. Eventually, the two governments will have to, come to the negotiating table. And of course, if they can manage, there's no guarantee, but if they can manage under this nasty, bruising, costly tariff fight through negotiation, that would be, I think, is a positive for investors, sentiments. It provides huge sigh of relief to financial markets, and it will provide some more certainty assurance, for long-term investors in China, here in the U.S., and I think globally.
Well, there are a number of opportunities for the two gentlemen to meet in later parts of this year and APEC and other occasions as well. Do you see that there are certain conditions as right. You mentioned that it is very important to start negotiating, to have contact and so on. Obviously, we know that there's very little contact, and certainly we don't think that negotiation is really taking place, at least not seriously. Do you think the conditions are not right? And yeah.
No, so I think, I can think of a variety of plausible scenarios or conditions under which the two governments will, meet and discuss tariffs, right? But the first, I think, the most important is really, we're still in the early days, right? So the financial markets are, by nature, react more strongly and early, right? So as we have seen, the market volatility and particularly the rise of the government bond market, led to a kind of relief or pause, right, in terms of reciprocal tariff, at least temporarily, right? That's a good example. As I mentioned earlier, as time goes by, the real economic cost of such a high tariff, okay, will become more evident, okay, and the pain by ordinary consumers and by small businesses in particular will also more keenly felt every day. So that in turn would generate substantially higher social and political pressure, prompting the two governments come to the negotiation table sooner rather than later. Right? So that's first on the real cost, because people now, I think, they're complacent, think there's no real damage done, right? But wait 1 quarter, 2 quarters, you'll see the cost will escalate much higher than they are today. So the second, I also think that there are maybe some narrow issues. For example, fentanyl, right? If U.S. China can manage to forge agreement on fentanyl, that may provide a kind of off-ramp to de-escalate and to set the conditions for tariff talks. And then also don't forget there's some other necessarily non-trade issues, where if China can play a constructive, helpful role, for example, ending the Russian-Ukraine conflict, or maybe the Middle East conflict, that again, may be helpful, creating kind of conciliatory, more positive climate for hard-nosed, trade negotiations. So there are catalysts, there are conditions,
right.
And I think just given the stake is so high, and I actually think China has every reason to look for the first available window of opportunity to settle the nasty trade dispute.
And what might be the first opportune moment for that?
Well, so, including maybe the two leaders, if they reach out to each other directly, that could really provide necessary impetus, right? So, trade negotiation, tariff, I think, in the early era, maybe when Bob, was in the government, the Chinese government will find it very easy to feel comfortable, trust enough to talk to each other, right? Right now, I just don't think there's enough relationship, at the cabinet level and also technocratic level. You need really the two presidents engage with each other directly. Not necessarily the nitty-gritty, discussion, but to set the framework. Maybe kind of the contour of what a trade deal look like. And there may be some the most critical conditions, right? So that I think would be very helpful.
All right, Kevin.
Yeah, I would simply say that I think the largest two economies today in the world have had a mutually beneficial economic relationship for over 4 decades now, right? So that relationship has to land somewhere. We all know that. But I think it's not going to land at the current level of tariff. I think everybody today we have a de facto embargo on many sectors, right? So I cannot imagine a world where the number one and number two economy embargo each other. That's for whose benefits, right? So it's going to land somewhere. It's not going to land what it has today. It will probably not land back to last year, right? So it's somewhere in the middle, and I think the problem of the financial markets is that the financial markets essentially net present value things based on linear extrapolation, right? And here we're not in a linear world. This is a holding pattern for whatever we're going to land. So I think as an investor, we just have to recognize, number one, this is a holding pattern. It's not going to be there. You should not linearly extrapolate based on what I have today, and then use your wisdom to think about where the landing point would be. That would be my more philosophical comment on this.
Okay, now the next question, you won't be so philosophical. The Swiss-owned Partners Group that you represent, responsible for whole of Asia, is Europe's largest private equity firm. And given the capital decoupling that is already taking place, and probably going to be even more so, how is the Partners Group recalibrating its global investment strategy to ensure the European capital remains competitively poised and deployed and not structurally sidelined?
Okay, I will first say that I think my Swiss co-founders may be unhappy for me to say this on the record, but we're a global firm. So the fact that we
I do apologize that you are on the record.
No, I'm kidding. The fact that we're headquartered in Switzerland is wonderful. I think that gives us a lot of the DNA of the firm. But we're a global firm, right? So today we're a global firm. If you look at how we have invested over the last couple of decades, that we have invested in a very balanced way, probably 45% in the US, similar amount to Europe, and then a smaller percentage for the rest of the world. For us as a global investor, I think we do have a luxury or privilege that we look at the world in what we call a relative value framework, right? For one particular sector, one particular subsector, as a global investor, we could decide at any point of time where to deploy our capital based on that relative value, right? That's my first point. My second quick point is that, our capital base comes from over 900 institutional LPs, right? They are everywhere. So we are not dependent on one or two investors who may or may not be more exposed to geopolitical sentiments than others, right? When you have 900 institutions backing us, and a much larger number, obviously, on the private wealth side, so we have a fairly balanced capital base. And maybe the optimistic side, I would say, we as an investor, when we see inefficiencies like what we see today, right? This is probably the most inefficient time I have seen in the last decades in terms of things getting politicized, and there are different views, and bidders and sellers don't agree on a price, right? This is almost opportunity for us, right? So, because we trade on long-term judgment, and we take advantage of inefficiencies. When you live in a completely globalized, efficient world, everybody agrees on everything. There is no opportunity for us to bring return to our LPs.
Right. Well, Kevin, you mentioned about inefficiencies in the system, and that represent opportunities, right? Give us a couple of examples, and how does the partner group exploit the arbitrage of inefficiencies for better returns?
Yeah, I probably can't go to too much details, but I would say
hypothetical examples. Yeah.
I would say, let's for example, right? If one of the markets we're very active in is called, it's a bit technical, it's the private equity secondaries, right? So we GPs trade LP stakes, and hypothetically, if you have an LP who wanted to sell their GP stake, the LP stake in a particular fund for non-commercial reasons, right? That just happens all the time. And then that creates that room for us to value something maybe a little bit higher than what the seller wants to sell. Then that creates an opportunity for that inefficiency, that different views on the valuation of the same asset. In this case, it's LP stake, right? So things like this happen all the time. I'm not saying the the current geopolitics is the only reason for inefficiency, right? There are a lot of inefficiency in the world. I'm just saying this is one more source of inefficiency.
Right.
And as a private market investor, inefficiency is usually good for return.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, when I was working for Temasek, about 9 years ago, when we started out, we used to joke that 70% of our time was spending chasing transactions, and by the time I retired, 70% of the time we're trying to chase geopolitics. And, so in a multivariate equation, that politics is not even a variable; it's a coefficient. Right? Secretary, let me go to you, and before Zhang Lu.
I'll be very brief. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been involved in this stuff for almost 60 years, including running Goldman Sachs and running the Treasury Department. I think I disagree with you slightly on the inefficiency point, because the question of inefficiency is relative to uncertainty. And it is true that secondaries, I actually think secondaries are an interesting area. But it may be that the inefficiencies seem like inefficiencies really are not, but a reflection of just a massive uncertainty and risk. And that particularly relates to the relationship between China and the United States, and also to the issues we have in the United States today. One of America's foremost historians said to me she thought that this was the greatest threat to our republic, what's going on right now, the greatest threat to our republic since its founding, except for the Civil War. And a lot of that related to the rule of law. And I'm just now repeating, then I'll keep quiet. I'm only repeating what happened yesterday. The president went on one of the Sunday, not yesterday, Sunday, one of the Sunday shows, and he was asked, "Do you believe you're bound by the Constitution?" He said, "I don't know." Well, that should be a relatively troubling comment to anybody who thinks about the rule of law and its importance in the functioning of any economy. By the way, I think China has some big rule of law questions too.
Thank you, sir. Zhang Lu.
No, I just want to add on what Kevin mentioned. I think for us as a private sector investor, the benefit of us doing investment is the long term. So we're not looking at the next 2 or 3 years going to happen in the market. We're looking at the next 5 to 7 years. Then when we're looking back, when there's more uncertainty, they bring lots of anxiety to the market. When there's anxiety in the market, people are willing to make changes. When they're making changes, they're welcome to embed new innovation technology. So from our perspective, looking at all this uncertainty putting together is increasing the spending on the innovation, the AI integration, and digital transformation across the board, not only tech industry. Just want to add in a quick example of what Kevin mentioned.
Does Vision Fund deploy capital in China as well?
No, we only invest in the United States.
Only in the U.S. Okay, right. So next time my next question is on international capital, right?
Uh-huh.
So how do you see international capital owners reshaping their investment strategy in Asia? Maybe not directly yourself, but maybe that your peers, the others may be running a more international fund in nature. If not, Kevin certainly can comment on that.
Yeah.
So how do you go about, developing and reshaping your investment strategy in Asia, particularly in Asia, and maybe India as well, right? Given the geopolitical climate, regulatory shifts, and push for localization by Chinese companies, and maybe by extension to that in India. Also, do you want to comment on that, or Kevin want to start first?
You get start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. And for our firm, right, Asia, we've been investing in Asia for over 2 decades, and the key markets like Australia, India, China, we have all had very good experience, right? The way we handle those markets is to try to focus on domestic sort of oriented companies, right? So I'll give you a live example. I think last week we got approval for IPO of one of our portfolio companies in China. It's called Green Tea. This is a casual fine dining sort of Chinese food chain. I have about close to 500 restaurants in China. If you look at assets like this, the reason we're comfortable going IPO is that it's really not affected by all those exciting things we have been talking about and debating about, right? This is to serve Chinese customers, which are still in that process of urbanization, they enjoy things.
Consumption.
Yeah, so I would say India as well has treated us very well, these 3 markets. And then Asia has also newer markets that are exciting. Japan, for example, like we have been observing that for many years. So therefore, the short answer is that we focus on each market by itself, right? We don't necessarily assume huge premium based on globalization, because these are the assumptions today that are being challenged.
Right.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I can add into that. Although we only deploy capital in North America, but look at Silicon Valley in general. Now 60% of the unicorn company in Silicon Valley are immigrant founder. They have immigrant founder.
60%.
60%, more than half. And Silicon Valley have 40% of local residents are people like me, first generation immigrant. And also same thing when we look at a company are doing AI innovation and across the board, they all have a strong global perspective. So that's one data I really want to share. Another thing is when we are chatting with our LP are large institutional, including some sovereign wealth fund. They also are talking with us about opportunity in different markets. You mentioned about Japan, Korea, you mentioned about India. Indians talking about, we have this interesting discussion in Davos earlier this year about, they realize, okay, AI may bring lots of changes, lots of disruption for the existing IT industry. What is the future? Next generation supply chain due to the geopolitical issue, can they potentially work along that, getting like 10-20% opportunity? And Japan talk about robotics innovation because they have robotics on the foundation, how to add in AI, edge computing to make it smart robots. And Korea, people didn't know Korea have such a huge number of highly educated engineers. That's all the opportunity. Opportunity for capital deployment. Another opportunity, why I go back to earlier on mentioned about the background of all these founders. They're global perspective founder. They're also thinking about leverage global talent. They're also thinking about leverage global market. After they start with the U.S. market as one of probably the best market to initial commercialization, especially we focus on B2B market here, but go beyond there. Not only some of their customers they're working with are global exposure already, they also are thinking about being able to leverage different ecosystem to access to better data. We talk a lot about AI. Essentially, the core of AI for next stage of innovation is the quality of the data. Quality of the data, one thing, diversity of the data, another thing, and also AI regulation. All three things could benefit from the global collaboration.
Exactly. We'll come back to AI again.
Yeah.
Actually, you mentioned about this. ChatGPT, the number one most profitable market is Korea.
Most of the users who pay.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. They pay.
I'm not sure whether this can be public shared. So.
It's a very well-known fact, right? And the use case in Korea is the most varied and the most advanced. But anyway, that's just
I would say that's because it's not accessible in China, right? So China has also proven,
DeepSeek.
Through the age of mobile internet, Chinese consumers, if they really like app, a product, technology, they're willing to pay as well. So that's why all these great companies, not only big, but also they are extremely profitable, right? ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, and the like. But it's just, this are again related to the broader canvas of geopolitics in the background. So OpenAI, GPT-4 is not available, to Chinese consumers. So, but in case of China specifically, outside the US, China is the next biggest, most vibrant tech ecosystem, okay, including AI. So I would say in terms of investment opportunities, we talk about inefficiency, but I would say, we are like growth-oriented investors, right? We're looking for new champions that are going to create enormous, the exciting technologies, disruptive technologies, but also really create a lot of value for shareholders, for society at large, right? So US, arguably is still the single biggest pool of opportunities. But I would say China is right behind the US as the next biggest, most vibrant, exciting opportunities.
Right. So still very investable. On the subject of AI, right? Do you foresee that the world of AI will be a hard decoupled world? In other words, there is a US-led AI world and there's a Chinese-led AI world. Much like what I'm doing today, I got to use WeChat to communicate with any friends, any colleagues in China. I have to use WhatsApp, Facebook to connect with any of my colleagues and friends in the US. But never the twain shall meet. I can't send any document from one to the other without me manually trying to figure out a roundabout way of doing that, which is absolutely, it drives me to nuts, right? So for people like me and others who need to travel to two sides of the world and to communicate with two sets of friends and colleagues, it's just not very pleasant. And I can foresee that in the AI world, we will be exactly the same. Am I optimistic or being practical here? Lu, you go ahead.
Okay, I can share. I think there are lots of discussion about DeepSeek earlier this year. I got many people calling me like, what is happening after public market react to it. But I do want to use DeepSeek as a perfect example to showing that even there are lots of geopolitical issue, tech innovation, the community be able to find a way to work together. So DeepSeek is actually an open source project, as you guys.
Well, WeChat and WhatsApp have not found a way to work together.
They're not, but for DeepSeek, the reason I want to use it as an example, it actually built on top of the large model innovation in the United States, benefit from the existing open source ecosystem here, and they develop a new architecture, make it so neat and lower cost, and open source it. And that architecture got learned by the local innovator in Silicon Valley again, and now we'll be able to lower the cost of the AI infrastructure dramatically.
So to my question, what are you going to see? Is it going to be one world or two worlds?
I think for the tech innovation, I think we're going to have two systems, but I think it will be one AI world.
Okay, great. Taking a position. Secretary.
I think you're raising a very fundamental question, Robin. I think there's just, my impression, I think this impression is probably right, is just massive distrust in both countries with respect to each other. And as long as that distrust obtains, I don't see how the kind of optimal world that you just described, Robin, or hope for, is going to happen. And I think right now, we had somebody at the Council of Foreign Relations the other day, a former very senior official in the prior administration, said, how is the United States going to have a more effective role with China, relationship with China if we don't know whether the Chinese government wants to focus only on its internal stability, which is fine, or wants to be hegemonic? Now, conversely, if I were Chinese, I would say, well, how do we have a relationship with the United States if we don't know whether you're willing to cooperate with us? We just want to contain us. And the question is, how do we get past all this? And I think, and particularly with this administration by the United States, which seems to have a very strong, aside from the trade issues, just a very strong animus against China, and the politics in the United States toward China, as you know, are very bad. I think we're stuck where we are, Robin, for quite a long period of time.
Yeah, I do agree with Bob. Lack of strategic trust between two countries is a huge roadblock for a better world. When AI become real, like a mass adoption by companies, consumers, society at large. But conversely, I think it's also imperative, just given how important AGI is. Remind me of the nuclear, atomic, weapon. Right? Robert Oppenheimer, as the father of first atomic weapon. Very soon after Manhattan Project, he championed for increased global dialogue, cooperation, and the safeguards to ensure atomic energy. At that time, it's like in the early days, only for peaceful use, not to as destruction of humanity as a whole. I do think AGI has tremendous benefits, societal and economic benefits, right, for the whole world. But there's also a lot of unknown, dangers, right? Maybe even existential threat to humanity. So I just think despite all the differences, all the lack of trust, it's essential for Beijing and Washington to also really sit down, obviously not just China and the US, but also Europe and the other stakeholders, international community, find a way to have truly global AI governance and safety standards. Yeah. So not the US standard, not the Chinese standard, but really global standards, so that we can ensure maximum benefits, but the minimum risks of the AI revolution.
Well put, and Secretary is going to disagree with you. Secretary.
No, I totally agree, but my question to Fred, by the way, if you all haven't read it yet, the book that Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger wrote about AI, it's worth reading, not because of its AI, but because of the ramifications, precisely what you mentioned, Fred. There are many positives, but there are also many dangers.
Exactly.
But my question to you, Fred, would be, agreeing with you that there's an imperative for the two countries to come together around AI and nuclear weaponry, at the very least, and climate change, I might add, which can destroy life on Earth as we know it, and so not irrelevant. How do we get from here to there?
So it's a good question, right? I do think, outside Washington and Beijing, right, the private sector, you need to find a way to work together, so preserve the essential global trade, despite the threat of tariff. Make sure, Bob, right, the economic history. Since first industrial revolution, economic prosperity and the trade always go hand in hand, right? That's for Europe, for North America, and for East Asia, no single exception successfully industrialized economy, could turn its back against the trade, right? But then, technology and, so I think private sector need to really make sure we have normal health trade, not disrupted by politics or geopolitics. And then, in terms of technology collaboration, I think Lu and other, mentioned it's a ambient, like a symbiotic ecosystem, right? Silicon Valley, 60% of the immigrants, that means some immigrants from India, from China, right? From Israel, from all over the world. That's how, that's the single biggest strength of America, right? Attracting immigrants, and then, so then, like what we've seen in mobile internet era, there's some Chinese technology apps can inspire the best, founders in the US to incorporate some of the, features, right? And vice versa. So I think, human being will more productive if we have, open, collaborative mindset. So I think, private sector can do better than academia, probably also care about, right? So now even university collaboration on nowadays, all the cutting edge papers in science, nature, there's no single. It's always like a team. And you see maybe half American, half Chinese, more often than not. But now with the current policy, that's been under threat, right? So we also make sure university, in terms of students, in terms of collaborative research on climate, on, next drug for cancer or dementia or Alzheimer, that we, bring the scientists, engineers working together to solve some of the toughest problems for the world. So I think keep this, then when the political conditions stabilize, improve, then I think we can talk about this some AI governance and other stuff.
Okay, I'm going to stop on the subject of AI now. I'm sorry, the time is running out, and so too is the battery of this pack here. But I do have a question from the audience, which I'm obliged to actually ask. Question is China truly committed to climate change solutions? How would you respond to skeptics that point to the continued significant growth in coal-fired power? Does anybody want to?
I want to do this.
All right, okay.
So I'm on the Nature Global Board and the co-chairman of Asia Pacific region. So I have, early on, kind of been writing and speaking about the importance of China, to have the energy transition, because China kind of, like the previous industrial nation, addicted to fossil energy, right? In case of China, it's really coal, and the coal is extremely polluting and the carbon, emitting copper. So yes, China still probably the biggest fossil energy consumer, coal, oil, and the gas. But China is also the single biggest investor in renewable energy. Okay, wind, solar, and others, even fusion technology. So actually, every year, the incremental capital investment and R&D, in capacity, gigawatt, installation in renewable, China is bigger than the next big economy, next 10 big economies combined, that including US, Japan, and other big, energy consumers. So yes, it's still a long way to go, but so far China is definitely very committed, not just by rhetoric, but by put money where mouth is, right? Actually spend the money, and in terms of transportation, EV mobility and others. Right? We have seen more and more examples. China has been the farthest along in energy transition.
So, Fred, are you or Kevin investing in green technology and energy transition in China at all?
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Answer for
Prolific
you?
investing.
Answer is yes
we
as well.
invest in green globally in a very substantial manner. Our infrastructure fund.
No, in China specifically.
Yeah. China, we are looking at projects as well, right? Okay. But let me just add one point on what Fred mentioned, right? I think on the topic of green economy, sustainability, I think the key to not live with all these contradictions, as Fred mentioned, China is on the one hand both at the forefront of the green economy, as well as there are certain issues from legacy, is not to look at as a moral dimension primarily, right? This is economic driver. People in China as well as anywhere else want to breathe clean air, right? They as their living standard improves, they want to enjoy greenery. So if you look at it from an economic driver perspective, it's very easy to reconcile what China is doing. But if you look at it as a moral high ground, then you find contradictions in China, like coal-fire and EVs.
Right, great. Next question is coming from the audience as well. What is the most important thing the Chinese government should focus to spur domestic consumption? Secretary, you want to give it a shot?
Well, I told you what I thought.
Yeah.
More secure social safety nets, particularly for retirement around an analog to Social Security and Medicare. And I think, I don't know if this is right or not, this is what Larry and I said to Gironji a long time ago, if you had a really robust credit card system, that might be helpful.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think, in addition to top, if China is seen really pro-growth, okay, pro-jobs, pro-private sector, then consumer confidence will improve, and they're going to be willing to spend, right? It's just when last couple of years, whether it's a pandemic or regulation on tech, on real estate, the general stance towards the private sector, had a chilling impact on, the public, on the mass sentiments. So they're very, very cautious. So as long as there's a clarity, there's a certainty and the stability in the Chinese context, and I believe Chinese consumers are very willing to spend. And actually, is the vast potential of spending power of Chinese middle class, which will be, the most crucial engine of growth. So in the current trade war climate, I think that's most effective defense and offense.
All right. So invest in Chinese consumption. Kevin, you want to?
Yeah, I would just, this is a great question. It's very hard to answer, but I'll give you an obvious and a non-obvious answer from my side, each in 30 seconds. So I think the obvious answer is that there are many cultural reasons, such as, Chinese people like to save or that spend, we don't want to borrow. Those are going to take a long time, right? Social safety net, the confidence. I think there's a whole basket of topics that are very obvious. It has been there for decades. There's no magic bullet here. The non-obvious answer I would give is the following, which may be controversial. I do think the East Asian culture, including the Chinese culture, is a more collective culture than what we see in the West.
Controversial about that, yeah.
Right? So they therefore, if you agree with that hypothesis, then I don't see any choice for the Chinese government to go with a slightly more collective route, such as what they're doing today, which is to encourage everybody to replace their elevators. And then the government would have a collective scheme to subsidize that, right? That would be very controversial here, right? That would be individual choice. But in China, if you go to those old buildings, 5, 6 floors in the past, there was no elevator, right? Now the government said if the building choose to do those things, we will collectively subsidize not only elevator, right? Refrigerator, all the appliances. I just think you have to accept the fact that it's a little bit more collective. Therefore, the response has to be a little bit more collective. I'm not diminishing individual choices.
Yeah, but I think also there's a generation changes as well. For example, for my generation, when we grew up, I think the world is in a perfect globalization period, and also I think that the consumer behavior is also hugely impacted by that. Then you look at how fast China adopt all this digital payment process, and also all this a new behavior from the younger generation. So I think things are shifting very fast.
Excellent, yeah, because people for foreigners going into China, I now can use Didi, I can pay with WeChat and with a foreign credit card. In the past, I couldn't do that. So COVID has done something for us. Thank you. I'm going to just round up the discussion with one final question for everybody, and that is China an existential threat or a legitimate part of the changing world order, right? So as we know that, right, I mean, China's global influence is growing very significantly in ways that will cause the liberal democracies some angst, right? So the U.S. and its allies will hate to determine whether a China that is a softer incarnation of its current self should be regarded as a legitimate part of a changing global order, or should it still be treated as an existential threat? I'm going to just go in this order, starting with you, Fred.
Well, the rise of China definitely poses certain challenges in certain dimensions, right? Just given the sheer size, scale, and speed of change. So it's kind of disruptive in terms of the existing order, the stability, the certainty. But, net, China's rise is also a tremendous opportunity. As for many years already, China has demonstrated China can, together with the U.S. as the two most crucial engines of global economic growth, right? And as a trade nation, and now increasingly as a big source of FDI into especially global South, right? So China really has a role to play to ensure global economic prosperity, and also now with the AI and the other, China become a technology powerhouse. So more and more technologies will be invented, and that also will diffuse into many of the trading partners, especially in global South. So net, I think is a blessing, is a positive rather than a negative.
Lu?
Yeah, so I think, of course, there's a way you look at it from a perspective as a government and policymaker, but there's also, for example, from us, we're an innovator, we're doing innovation. Competition is always better for innovation. More competition bring better innovation and also bring much bigger productivity improvement. And another thing, just as Fred mentioned early on, I think we're in this exciting time that AI is evolving so fast. And people would always assume AI is only for consumer. No. The traditional IT enterprise SaaS market is only less than 10% of US GDP, but now we're talking about AI for all service market, which essentially go over more than 50% of the US GDP, and broadly, globally. I think no matter we like it or not, the two biggest economy has to work together, including what Fred mentioned about AI governance. That's the main issue. If we only look at consumer, you may or may not care your data privacy, but if you would talk about insurance industry, healthcare industry, financial industry, we have to collaborate to have the right regulation in place. Another thing also you guys mentioned about the climate tech, but more important is energy consumption. One of the major challenge of AI right now is energy consumption. Before we run out the GPU, we're going to run out the energy. And how to really be able to collaborate to produce more energy in the efficient way to make it possible for AGI even come to realization. It may not come if we don't have this fundamental infrastructure problem solved.
Exactly. We're going to improve the power grid as well. Thank you.
Exactly.
Kevin.
Yeah, maybe, Robin, your question of China's role in the world order, I would just say, it's a country of 1.4 billion people. There's no way to keep a country of 1.4 billion people out of the world order, no matter how you try and no matter how who tries it. And secondly, I think if you look at the Chinese history for thousands of years, right, it's a farming society. When you have a farming society, the focus is to clear your land, is to grow plants rather than necessarily going out to expand, to intermediate, to play that role. So in fact, I think that's a problem. My interactions with Beijing is that too much focus bandwidth is focused on domestic issues. They sometimes forget that as Chinese economy grow today compared to 30 years ago, it's such a center of gravity on a lot of things. They cannot ignore that spillover effect to other countries anymore. So my answer to you is that it's the opposite. To see China as a threat, I almost see the opposite. Like Chinese need to think about there is consequences what they do domestically, internationally. They need to be careful with that rather than the problem the U.S. face, which is sometimes overly expansive with international affairs.
Well, thank you. We start with Secretary Rubin. We end with Secretary Rubin.
Okay. Okay.
And we're not on the record, Secretary. No.
I thought we were on the record.
We're in the record.
I already said too much. Anyway, no, I agree with you just said. I do think China, this is my view, whatever it's worth, I think China needs to be cognizant of the ramifications outside of China of what it does. But I'm going to repeat something I said before, and I'm repeating myself, I know, but I think firstly, we have the Trump problem and the animus he has toward China.
Yeah.
But let's get past that for the moment. There is a real problem, which is how do we view, Henry Kissinger used to say, I knew Henry pretty well, Henry Kissinger used to, in fact, quite well, Henry Kissinger used to say that China really focuses on its internal stability, not on being not on being a hegemon. But unfortunately, the perspective of the United States is the opposite now, that there's a focus on being hegemonic, at least in the region and maybe internationally. I don't know what the realities are of Xi Jinping and of the Chinese government, but it seems to me if that's not where they are, then they should make it clear it's not where they are. Conversely, the perspective of the United States is a position where it wants to contain China. Now, that's probably in response a little bit to what I've just said, but the United States has to, in my opinion, not be in that posture. Not try to contain China, but try to work with China. But I'll repeat what I said before. You have these two areas, this enormous distrust in both countries, based on the things I've just said. How do we get past that? And Hank Paulson, as I said, had a piece in the Washington Post yesterday or today, whenever it was, I don't know, with a plan that seemed to me make a certain amount of sense. But whatever the answer may be, Fred, it goes back to something you said before. It's imperative they work together, but how do we get from where we are to where we need to be?
Yeah.
Thank you. On that note, time is up. Thank you.